Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Partners in Care Safeguarding Adults Forum in December 2025. And today we're really pleased to welcome Marie Martin, who is a Senior Specialist in the Safeguarding and Closed Cultures team with the Care Quality Commission. Marie is going to talk about safeguarding from a regulator's perspective. Thank you, Marie. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for asking me to come and speak with you today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about safeguarding from a CQC perspective, talking a little bit more about our role and our approach to safeguarding, and giving you a little bit of an indication of the kind of things that we look for as a regulator. So just a little bit of a reminder before we start of our general role within CQC. I'm sure many of you are aware, but we are responsible for registering care providers, and that includes us monitoring, inspecting and rating services. So that ongoing work that we do with services. I'm sure many of you are aware, we also take action to protect people who are using services who might be at risk of or experiencing abuse. But also very important is we speak with our independent voice. So we will publish our views on potential quality issues in health and social care. And I'm sure many of you will have seen our state of care reports where we actively talk about our concerns or our issues we've identified. But in terms of our role in safeguarding, we have an overall objective in safeguarding to make sure that providers of regulated health and social care services provide that safe, good quality care and treatment that doesn't expose people to either the risk of or the experience of abuse, improper treatment and neglect, and protects people from harm. So our approach to assessing safeguarding practice within providers thinks about systems and processes within each of our 5 key questions. So although we report on safeguarding in our safe key question, it isn't just all about safe. I'm sure many of you will appreciate you can't have a caring service where people are actively being abused, and we can't say it's a well-led service if there aren't the policies, the procedures, the governance in place to ensure that safeguarding is carried out effectively. So although we report on it in our safe key question, it does thread across everything that we do in terms of our regulation. So we do have a statutory duty to protect and promote the health, safety and welfare of people who are using health and social care services. And our functions and duties are set out in the Health and Social Care Act 2008. So thought it was probably worth mentioning a little bit about our regulatory remit and what our role actually is if we suspect that abuse is happening. So we will absolutely make a safeguarding referral to the local authority if we believe that abuse or neglect is happening, or there's a risk of serious or significant harm to a person and the local authority don't already know about that. We respond to concerns where we suspect abuse or neglect, so we will follow up on those and think about a potential regulatory breach. We also work with partner agencies, so local authorities, NHS England, integrated care systems and the police. And that is sometimes in parallel with our own follow-up work and their investigations or inquiries. But what we don't do is we haven't got that statutory duty to investigate safeguarding concerns. We don't have that Care Act Section 42 inquiry responsibility in the way that the local authority do. And of course, we know that the police will investigate if a crime's been committed. So we won't strictly investigate safeguarding concerns, but we will follow up on potential regulatory breaches. And we also don't routinely attend multi-agency meetings that the local authority hold or safeguarding adult review meetings. But if there is a reason why it would be appropriate for us to attend, for example, there might be a serious incident, possibly a failure of care or harm to service users. We could be looking at potential breach of regulations, possibly taking or considering enforcement action, or we might have concerns about systemic failure or organisational abuse, or perhaps maybe a registered manager or nominated individual are implicated. So under those circumstances, we would absolutely get involved in those multi-agency meetings. And apologies, I don't know why the title hasn't come up, but thought it was probably worth mentioning a little bit about our roles and responsibility in relation to the Mental Capacity Act and DOLS, because we know that is a key part of safeguarding. So we do check how registered health and care services apply the Mental Capacity Act, and we make sure that they comply with the requirements of the Health and Social Care Act. So within our regulations, we do talk about Mental Capacity Act and deprivation of liberty. So we will make sure that people are complying with the regulations. We do have a responsibility specifically to monitor the use of dolls in all care homes and hospitals. So what we should be doing is monitoring provider compliance as part of any ongoing work that we have with the provider. And that includes if we receive a notification or any particular information, when we're carrying out our inspections, and in any engagement that we're having with providers. So those ongoing conversations. Now, we do receive notifications from providers about the outcomes from a DOLS application. So, as part of providers' registration with us, they're required to notify us of the outcome of any DOLS application. So, not when they're applying, but when they know the outcome. And that includes if the application has been authorised, if it's been refused, or if it's been withdrawn. So, if, for example, the person's no longer deprived of their liberty or they're no longer receiving services. So we should be receiving those notifications in a timely way and on our notifications form. And we do use this information to look for any potential themes or trends or concerns around the appropriate use of dolls. We also check on the use of dolls by visiting the places where they're used. So when we're visiting care homes and hospitals, we will look at how dolls is being applied. So, for example, we expect providers to know who is deprived of their liberty, what the legal framework is for this, what the people's rights are, and they should also know their own responsibilities and be able to produce documentation to evidence that they're fulfilling those. And incredibly important as well, we also encourage improvement. So when we see good practice, we share that. We want other people to see that, and we want to encourage people to follow better practice. But also, if we are identifying that there are particular issues, we will take regulatory action where necessary. And what we want to see is improvements as a result of that. So within CQC, we don't have direct powers to enforce the Mental Capacity Act, but we do still have a clear role. So as I've mentioned, we should be highlighting pockets of good practice and we should be reporting on this, but also taking action against providers when we see breaches. So you'd normally see this under Regulation 11, consent, or Regulation 13, safeguarding. And we are able to take civil and criminal action for breaches within these regulations. And I also need to mention that we also use our independent voice function to report on MCA and DOLS. So you will see a chapter in our State of Care report that we recently published in October. So little plug for that there. We also raise concerns in the application of the legislation when we identify this. So, for example, we previously responded to and fed into the consultations around liberty protection safeguards. And we also recently wrote to the Department of Health and Social Care to raise our concerns about the ongoing DOLS backlog. Okay, but in terms of what we expect from services in relation to safeguarding, so our regulations, our overall expectations of providers, they remain the same, they haven't changed, regardless of the type of service or the area of practice. So we have our quality statements currently, and those are the commitments that providers, commissioners, and system leaders should be living up to. They're currently expressed as we statements. We are currently in the middle of a consultation around our assessment framework moving forwards. But what they show is what's needed to deliver that high quality person centered care. And the quality statements that we're currently using are based on people's experiences and the standards of care that they expect. So overall, we need to know that there are reliable systems, processes, and practices in place to keep people safe and safeguarded from abuse. And these are being followed effectively. We hold all providers to the same standard, and we use the same quality statement for safeguarding across all sectors. So I'm sure many of you will have heard of our fundamental standards or our regulations. And it's really tempting to think of safeguarding appearing in only Regulation 13. It's what it says on the tin, safeguarding from abuse. But we could probably make a case of saying that safeguarding features across many, or if not all of these particular standards on the screen. So if you think about, for example, nutrition and hydration, regulation 14. So if somebody isn't being fed and watered, they're malnourished, they're dehydrated, that's a safeguarding issue. So you will largely see safeguarding referred to under regulation 13, but it is worth mentioning that you could see it related to any of the other regulations. But I am going to focus a little bit on Regulation 13 because this is the one that is clearly about safeguarding. And the intention of this regulation is to safeguard people who are using services from experiencing any form of abuse or improper treatment while they're receiving that care and treatment. And improper treatment includes things like discrimination, unlawful restraint, and that includes inappropriate or unlawful deprivation of liberty under the Mental Capacity Act. So, in order to meet the requirements of this regulation, providers have got to have a zero tolerance approach to abuse, unlawful discrimination, and restraint. So, no abuse, no neglect, no degrading treatment, no unnecessary or disproportionate restraint, no deprivation of liberty without legal framework is okay. Providers must have robust procedures and processes in place to prevent people from experiencing abuse while they're in the service. Where any form of abuse is suspected, or if it occurs, or if it's discovered, we expect the provider to take appropriate action without delay. So this includes following up and referring to the appropriate body. We can prosecute for breaches of Regulation 13 if a failure to meet the regulation results in avoidable harm to someone who's using the service, or if somebody using the service is exposed to significant risk of harm. We don't have to serve a warning notice before prosecution, and there are other regulatory actions that we can take. We will refuse registration as well if providers can't satisfy us that they're able to and will be fulfilling this regulation. Now, we don't always talk about this regulation in terms of safeguarding dignity and respect. It's not one of the regulations that we can prosecute for, but we can still take regulatory action for breaches. And the intention of this regulation is to really make sure that people who are using the service are treated with respect and dignity at all times while they're receiving that care and treatment. So, in order to meet this regulation, providers must be making sure that they're providing care and treatment in a way that ensures people's dignity and treats them with respect at all times. This includes making sure that people have got privacy when they need it or when they want it, treating them as equals, providing any support they need to be autonomous, independent, and involved in their local community. And providers must also have due regard to any relevant protected characteristics as defined within the Equality Act. And again, we must refuse registration if providers can't satisfy us that they can and will be continuing to comply with this regulation. So it's incredibly important in terms of people's experience of care that they are treated with dignity and respect. Okay, so in terms of what we expect to see from providers, well, we expect providers to have an open culture, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about culture shortly. But workers should feel able to report concerns and be supported in that without fear of recrimination. And we also expect that concerns are thoroughly investigated at an early stage and any issues identified and resolved, action taken to address that. So remember, good safeguarding practice isn't just about the safe key question. It threads across safe, effective, caring, responsive, and well led. But in terms of what we expect to see from providers, some kind of general expectations. So these are fairly standard, fairly obvious, but we want providers to have a strong understanding of safeguarding. It should be threaded through absolutely everything they're doing. It should be part of their ethos, one of the foundations of their building blocks of how they're working. So they should fully understand safeguarding and what their responsibilities are and how to take appropriate action. We know that things go wrong sometimes. We know that safeguarding incidents occur. But what are people going to do when they do happen? How are they going to mitigate the risks? How are they going to respond to them? And afterwards, how are they going to learn from things that have happened and embed that learning? It's important that people are supported to understand safeguarding, so thinking about what being safe means to them and how to raise concerns themselves if they don't feel safe or might have concerns about maybe other service users or other staff. Um, I've already mentioned about the building blocks, but it's about having that effective governance, those systems, processes in place to make sure people are protected. So the policies, the procedures, the guidance, the audits, the reviews. It's about having those in place, but also making sure they're embedded. People know what's expected of them. They know what the processes are. They know how to apply them. So effective processes, not just having processes. And that real commitment to immediate action to keep people safe from abuse and neglect. And this does involve a lot of partnership working with partners in that collaborative way. So this also, and I am talking about safeguarding adults primarily, but this also includes children. Even if services aren't providing care to children, think family. There could be an adult service user who's come into services who may have children at home who might potentially be at risk in some way. So it's always thinking about the family, the people don't live in isolation. So that reminder to think family and think about other people who might be at risk of abuse. But also, we expect people to feel supported. I mean, if we go back to that dignity and respect and the person centered care, there's a person at the end of this. There's somebody who's experiencing abuse or neglect or is feeling unsafe. So it's incredibly important within that caring service, within that well led service, within that effective service, that people are receiving the support they need. Where it's applicable to the service, there needs to be that clear understanding of the deprivation of liberty safeguards. I've already mentioned in terms of Regulation 13, that includes inappropriate restraint or deprivation of liberty that's not authorised. So it's important as part of safeguarding that people have a clear understanding. Already mentioned about the safeguarding systems, processes in practice, but thinking very much about upholding people's human rights and protecting them from discrimination. I've already mentioned about people being supported to understand their rights and how to keep themselves safe. And again, can't stress this enough. Good partnership working. We know that when things go wrong in terms of safeguarding, one of the things that we hear time and time again is people didn't talk to each other, they didn't communicate, they didn't know what the other person was doing. So that's why it's so important. Conversations like this, me coming along today, us having the open dialogue, because we all want the same thing. We want people to be safe. Effective training, I always have to caveat this with it isn't just about the percentages of people who've attended training. It's about how effective that training is, how meaningful, how relevant, and how embedded. You could have 100% of people attending a training session, but if they haven't talked about it afterwards, if it hasn't resonated with them, they haven't learned anything, and they don't keep having the conversation, then that is not effective training and it doesn't equip people to carry out their roles effectively. Safeguarding on the agenda. Well, clearly, safeguarding is on the agenda with you guys because I'm talking to you now and I'm within this forum. But it's so important that we don't just think about safeguarding when something goes wrong. It's something that we're always thinking about. And tying in with that effective training, that needs to equate into staff knowledge and understanding. So, do they know what their responsibilities are? Do they understand that? And do they understand how they should be working? I've already mentioned good governance, but doesn't hurt to mention it again. Um, Already mentioned as well about investigations. So we know that things go wrong sometimes, but it's about how the provider responds to that. So we don't expect a provider to come and say, we've never had any safeguarding concerns, everything's fine, because that in itself is a red flag, because we know that things go wrong. We're working with people, things happen, and sometimes people do experience harm or placed at risk of harm. What we want to see is a learning organisation. We want to see people who follow up on those concerns, they investigate them, they learn lessons, and they embed that into practice moving forwards. Legally compliant, I've already mentioned the Mental Capacity Act and DOLS, but things like the Equality Act, Human Rights Act, the Care Act, and also the Health and Social Care Act, of course, which is our piece of legislation. Are people thinking about a least restrictive practice? Is there a less restrictive way that they can support that person? So, are there any unnecessary blanket restrictions? Best practice, we know that there is always new information coming out, new guidance, new recommendations. Are people keeping up to date or with that, or are they just saying, well, we've always done it in this way, so we will just carry on doing that? One thing that we are always talking about within CQC is thinking about the wider risks to others using the service. So we're not just thinking about that one person or the two people who may potentially have experienced abuse or neglect. Is there a risk to other people? Could this happen again? We might have thought about how that person's kept safe, but could this potentially happen to other people? So always thinking about the wider risks to other people. And last but definitely not least, transparency. We want to have the open and honest conversations. If people come to us and say, no, 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 no safeguarding issues, no problems at all, but we find out that there have been issues, then that really raises concerns. We want to have the open and honest conversations, and we don't penalise people if they come to us and say, we've had a bit of a problem. We have the conversations. We want to see how people have responded to that. Okay, it is worth mentioning our notifications because there's often some confusion around when safeguarding concerns should be notified to the CQC because our requirements don't always align with the local authorities. We also don't expect there to be proof that abuse has taken place. We don't expect people to have investigated beforehand. As you'll see on the screen here, the regulation talks about any abuse or allegation of abuse. So this is part of Regulation 18 of our Care Quality Commission registration regulations of 2009. And what it says is that the registered provider must notify us without delay of any abuse or allegation of abuse which occurs while services are being provided in the carrying on of a regulated activity or as a consequence of the carrying on of a regulated activity. So we don't expect providers to tell us about every allegation of abuse that they refer to the local safeguarding procedures if it is not related to the regulated activity. That's the key issue. If it's occurring or if it's occurred during the carrying on or as a consequence of the carrying on of a regulated activity. So there may be times when a local authority might say, "Oh, yeah, we don't want you to tell us about those particular safeguarding concerns." But if it meets our requirements within the statutory notifications, we should still be notified. So just that word of caution that there are times when our requirements don't quite line up with the local authorities. So thought it was probably worth mentioning that. Okay, so it is worth mentioning that we do walk into services looking for good or even outstanding practice examples. We want to see good safeguarding practices. And one of the things that we probably don't get to talk about often enough are the really positive things that we see in practice. And it is one of the much more rewarding parts of our role when we're seeing services improve to the point where they might obtain and hopefully maintain an outstanding rating. One of the important parts of our role that I've already mentioned is not only highlighting where practice needs to improve, but also where we see other good areas of practice to share those so they can be celebrated and other providers can learn from them. I will be honest, it's been a bit of a challenge to find some examples of services that have been rated outstanding and safe, which is where safeguarding sits within our reporting. Where services have been rated as outstanding, this is most often seen in examples of outstanding caring. And this is where examples of dignity and respect also come in. So, as you'll see in this first box, we had a home care agency who were rated as outstanding in caring. And the report talked about an exceptionally person centered service. So, really thinking about the person's individual needs, putting them at the center, thinking about what they needed to thrive, and that culture of openness, empathy, and inclusion, and making sure that people were involved in care decisions. So it's really about putting people at the center of their care and making sure that people were listened to and respected. So I thought that was a really good example of where privacy and dignity and person-centered care do come in. We've also got a lovely example here of a care home who were rated as outstanding in caring. They were good in safe, but there was a mention of the high level of skill in staff recognising when people weren't feeling safe. and being proactive in challenging unsafe practices. So, and the outcome of that was that people felt valued, respected, and cared for. So they received outstanding in caring, but there were some really good examples of where they were doing safeguarding really well. And last but definitely not least, we had another care home that was rated outstanding and good in safe. And as part of the good in safe, they talked about the leaders and staff completing safeguarding training that equipped them for their role. It was relevant to what they were doing. They were reporting safeguarding incidents and using those to learn lessons. So they acknowledged things went wrong and they talked about how to learn from them. And people were safeguarded well. They had a real positive safety culture, and it was about that openness and honesty again. So you can see a couple of themes there. And they did encourage feedback. They investigated incidents and they said sorry when things went wrong. But we do also sometimes see, I did manage to find some services that were rated as outstanding in safe. So we've got a home care agency here that was rated as outstanding in safe and outstanding in the safeguarding. And this was a service where the provider worked well with people and the partner agencies to really understand what being safe meant to them and the best way of achieving that. So there was a real focus on improving people's lives while protecting them. So it was about them living in safety, but also having a positive experience. And they shared concerns quickly and appropriately. They worked really well with people to understand what the best way of achieving safety, and staff, patients and service users were saying they felt safe with staff, and they felt that they were supported, but also in a safe place. Staff understood their responsibilities to report concerns about the service and to external agencies. And it talks about them having exceptional knowledge on recognizing and responding to all forms of abuse. So there was a real positive culture here. Staff made sure that people were actively encouraged to report any safeguarding concerns, and there was an ongoing dialogue. And on the right here, we've got a care home that was also rated outstanding in safe, and that includes for safeguarding. And this was a service that, again, worked well with partners to fully and with people to fully understand how to support them to be safe. So real focus on keeping people safe and working with them and encouraging people to speak up as well. That was a real strong bit here in terms of driving the service forward and using issues that have been found, identifying them, learning from them, and moving forward and sharing those lessons. So a couple of really good examples, I think, of where we have seen that outstanding practice in safeguarding. Thought it was probably worth a quick mention of what our registration colleagues look for in providers, because they are essentially the gatekeepers. So for a lot of providers, a lot of managers, this might be their first dip into the health and social care sector as a provider. And so we do have that slightly different approach that needs to look at the intent of the service, because they're not already providing care, health and social care support. So we look at their ability to provide a safe, effective service. So our registration team will very much look at interviewing and assessing providers and managers to test their understanding of and their commitment to safeguarding. Again, we test their systems and processes, so scrutinising their safeguarding related policies and procedures. We carry out site visits to make sure the premises are safe. Sometimes this is in person, sometimes virtually. But we also ask tailored questions, thinking about the specific service types and the client group. So thinking about things like pressure ulcers in nursing homes, or professional boundaries in domiciliary care. The key thing to remember is registration are the gatekeepers within CQC. So if there's an unfit provider or manager who wants to be registered, they should be keeping them out of the sector. So I've already talked quite a bit about provider responsibilities around safeguarding, but as I've already mentioned, Mental Capacity Act and DOLS are key aspects of good practice for safeguarding. So I thought it was also worth a brief mention of some of the things that we look for in terms of Mental Capacity Act and deprivation of liberty safeguards from providers. So again, that knowledge and understanding is incredibly key. So do providers and their staff know and understand the Mental Capacity Act? Do they know about and apply the principles? Do they understand how it impacts on their work? Do they understand people's rights and responsibilities? Does the training and the support they have equip them to carry out their legal responsibilities? incredibly important that we're seeing good mental capacity act practice in general, in line with the legislation and the principles, and that should be underpinning all practice. Um, I don't need to talk through these. I'm sure that you're very familiar with them, but things like involving the person as much as possible, thinking about less restrictive alternatives. We want to see evidence of time and decision-specific decisions, evidence of the decision-making process in line with the Section 4 best interest checklist, but also in a good conversations with people. So talking to them in advance about what they want from their care, what's important to them, speaking to them about lasting powers of attorney and getting copies of that, or any advanced decisions to refuse treatment, getting copies of those potentially. So we always want to see when somebody is obtaining consent, do they have capacity to consent to that? So with the presumption of capacity, we always have to assume that people do have capacity to give consent. But if you're trying to obtain consent from them and there's a little bit of a question around that, then we expect to see processes followed to assess capacity and support that person to be able to see if they are can consent. And again, sorry, I keep talking about good governance, but those policies, procedures, and audits to underpin practice. We also do still see some people who don't recognise that somebody's deprived of their liberty and they don't necessarily apply for an authorisation. We do know that there are massive backlogs in the processing on the assessment of DOLS applications, but providers should still be recognising if somebody potentially meets the requirements for a deprivation of liberty authorisation. So they should still be following through those processes. But we do expect to see an ongoing consideration of, is there a less restrictive way in which we can support this person effectively? So that practice should be happening all the time. I think I've mentioned most of these already, but also there is that conversation around if there have been particular changes while a provider is waiting for a DOLS assessment to take place, let the local authority know. They will look at prioritising, dependent quite often on resources and which are the most urgent applications. So if providers are having to deprive people more, if they are becoming more distressed, if the restrictions are increasing, let the local authority know. It's important that they're kept up to date. But we do expect to see that continual monitoring of and adapting of care. Is there a less restrictive way we can do this? Does the person need an independent mental capacity advocate? Do they need a care review? When authorisations are in place, following the conditions, but continuously providing information and support around the person's rights. And I have to mention again, notifying CQC of the outcome of an application to deprive someone of their liberty. So as I've mentioned, that is part of our registration requirements. Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different change of tack for a moment because it is worth mentioning that one of the things we look for very closely in services is we look at the culture. And in a good safeguarding culture, we expect to see that safeguarding is absolutely key to every part of the service. We expect it to be threaded through absolutely everything that's done. It's the real basis for safeguarding to be practiced well in an organisation. You need to have a good culture. You need to see an organisation where people are empowered to report and respond appropriate concerns wherever they might arise. One of the things that we have found is failures in safeguarding have shown that organisations can't deliver good safeguarding practice without a healthy safeguarding culture. And it is more than just having the policies in place. It's about having the conversations. It's about threading it through absolutely everything we're doing. Which does bring us very neatly onto closed cultures, and we do have a lot more information around this on our website. But it is worth mentioning. I've already talked a little bit about a safeguarding culture, but when we see a closed culture, we define that as a poor culture that can lead to harm, and that includes those human rights breaches such as abuse. And we know that in these services where there's a closed culture, people are much more likely to be at risk of deliberate or unintentional harm. It is important to note that a closed culture can happen within absolutely any service. It's not just relevant to services for people with learning disabilities and autistic people, or for mental health inpatient services, for example. Any service that is providing care could potentially have a closed culture. We know that certain features increase the risk of a closed culture. So that's things like services where people aren't able to leave of their own accord, live-in services, so things like shared lives or supported living, basically any service where one-to-one care is provided. That there are particular things, as I say, that mean it's more likely that somebody could develop a risk of a closed culture, but doesn't necessarily mean that there is one. And we've got four kind of key examples here of some of the things that people might experience, so or that might lead us to identify that there is a potential closed culture. So we think about people who are experiencing that poor standard of care, and that includes things like the unlawful restrictions or blanket restrictions for people that maybe aren't necessary to keep them safe, or quite often I think about when I see poor care, that often comes out in the language that people use. People aren't necessarily always spoken about respectfully amongst staff or potentially in records. So it's looking out for those kind of indicators that maybe somebody is experiencing that poor care. So things like staff belittling, maybe excluding or taunting people, not seeing individualized care plans, lack of reasonable adjustments, poor understanding or application of the Mental Capacity Act, inappropriate use of meds to restrain people or control behaviour. Really just seeing people not safeguarded against discrimination or abuse. Weak leadership or management. So you might sometimes see a service that hasn't had a manager or a leader for several months, or there isn't that strength, there isn't that drive, there isn't that commitment within the management. So people need to have a strong leader that people can go to, and we don't want to see things, allegations of bullying, excessive overworking. It's really thinking about that strong management to support people with what they need to do. It's an interesting one. Poor skills, training and supervision of staff providing care. We know that working in the health and social care system is hard work. It needs a lot of commitment. It takes a lot out of you, and you need an awful lot of support. So what we want to see are that staff are being given the support that they need in order to continue working effectively within that role. So it's about giving them their value. It's about supporting them with developing those skills, the training, making sure they've got appropriate supervision. And one of the things that we're obviously very involved in within CQC is that external oversight, but we can't be everywhere at all times. We can't kind of be in every service. So the kind of service we'd be concerned about is where there are limited interactions with those outside agencies. So you might see things like the provider not engaging in conversations with commissioners, or not submitting notifications to us, or safeguarding referrals to the local authority. So that real kind of closed, we won't let people in from the outside. So we need to see that external oversight. Okay, I think that this slide speaks for itself, really. I don't think I need to talk to this too much, but I think it speaks for itself in terms of why a positive culture and speaking up is so important. So we know there are so many examples where things have gone wrong. So it's just a little bit of a reminder there. Very sobering one, but a reminder. How do we look at safeguarding culture? So I'm talking about safeguarding culture, but what do we do in terms of CQC and looking at this? So we expect to see a safeguarding policy, but it needs to be an effective one. It should be clearly written. It should be located where people can find it and read it. Those policies that are behind the manager's desk and have got, it might be beautifully laminated, but if they've got dust coming off of them and cobwebs, then we know that people aren't actually reading that. So it should be really clear about how to identify, respond to, and manage safeguarding concerns. Should be relevant to the local area, because we know that sometimes people will download policies, but they need to make sure that it is relevant to them. It talks about their service. It includes the information that people need for local arrangements. It should explain how to report suspected abuse or neglect, and that includes those local arrangements. And it should reflect the principle of working together. Not one agency can keep everybody safe in safeguarding in isolation. So it's about how we all work effectively together. So those systems and procedures should be in place to make sure that people are recording and sharing information in line with appropriate information sharing about any particular safeguarding concerns. But it's also that tracking and monitoring of incidents and complaints and safeguarding concerns and allegations against staff. It's about identifying any patterns, any themes and trends and really investigating and learning from any particular issues. Roles and responsibilities. We talk a lot about safeguarding as everybody's responsibility, but sometimes that actually translates into nobody taking responsibility for safeguarding because it's everybody's responsibility. So maybe that next person will do it. We want to see everyone in the organisation understanding who's accountable for the different parts of safeguarding, knowing where to seek advice and support, because we all need a little bit of help sometimes. Are safeguarding responsibilities included in job descriptions? Does everyone understand how to meet their safeguarding responsibilities and have the support that they need? Positive culture. I mean, that's so that we could talk about that all day, but organizations that encourage those open conversations, concerns are reported, they're investigating the incidents, they're responding effectively, they're taking immediate action to make sure that people are safe. Are they using team meetings and supervision to share best practice? Because we know that things do go right sometimes, and if it's gone well, let's share that, let's talk about it, let's celebrate that. And alternatively, when things have gone wrong, is there any learning from any relevant safeguarding adults reviews or any other kind of reviews of safeguarding practice? Challenge poor practice. People should feel comfortable with being able to say, I don't think that's right, or I'm not sure if we should be doing this in that way. People should also be talking about the differences between poor practice, which might not be a safeguarding issue, and abuse or neglect, because we know that multiple examples of poor practice could actually tip over into a closed culture or an organizational abuse. Management and supervision. Managers are important within this. Leaders are important to ensure that that culture threads throughout the whole of the service. So managers, supervisors have got a really important role to play in encouraging and supporting staff to challenge that poor practice, raise those concerns, have the open and honest conversations, but also positively not acknowledge how people have learned from their experience and how we can do better moving forwards and how people can continue to develop. And last but definitely not least, reflective supervision. So debriefing, getting that self-awareness, the critical thinking, the thinking about how we've made our decisions, thinking through when things have gone wrong and learning from that, and discussing how you think things went and how things can be improved.